Good afternoon, folks. My name is Mike Gould, and I'm here to speak to you about maturing and scaling FHIR Exchange. This is a little bit of a story about our experience with Connectathons and continuous testing. And don't all scatter. All right, so in this session, we'll talk about how we've taken Vinci implementation guides into implementation and how we've enhanced this with our key testing partnerships, establishing basic connectivity and incrementally testing to successful end-to-end flows. The context in which I'm speaking is the Vinci project. And Vinci's focused on the intersection of the drive to improve patient outcomes in value-based care, interoperability with HL7 FHIR, and forcing functions of regulation and industry competition as well. The challenge facing Vinci is one to address the inefficiencies in healthcare by developing standards with multiple invested stakeholders, some perceived as even as adversaries or competitors, to collaborate on solutions and then implement them and measure their impact. This slide illustrates our current membership in the Vinci project, and we refer to this as the Coalition of the Willing. It includes several payers, providers, and other health IT vendors with unique and individual perspectives on how we should do things, coming together and bringing their capabilities to come up with standards that are evolutionary and form the basis for end-to-end solutions, not just for point solutions on use cases. So as we make incremental improvements, we discover new opportunities to improve even more. Vinci's brought many implementation guides forward with significant testing. The focus of my presentation here really is on the burden reduction stack, which is 3 implementation guides that include coverage requirements discovery, which establishes the relationship between a patient and a member with the payer, document and the need for or the eligibility for a service, documentation templates and payer rules, get to the medical policy or the administrative requirements that a payer may have to authorize and to pay on a claim for a particular item or service. And prior authorization support covers that request package based on the questionnaire or the clinical data that the provider puts with the request and submits to the payer requesting the actual authorization. And the other direction of the support, the prior authorization support, comes from the payer to provide the determination or the status or request more information. To the burden reduction stack, we also have the other Vinci implementation guide for clinical data exchange we call CDEX, and that's put in tandem with the burden reduction stack in the case where a payer requires additional information that the provider must supply. And we can do that outside of a questionnaire by using the CDEX implementation guide. This is another view, and I'm sorry for the eye chart, but this is really to give you a sense of the scope, even in more detail than what we saw in the last slide. So there are things that are proper to the implementation guides, but there are other things that lie outside the scope of the implementation guide that a payer or a provider need to address. So if you think about the payer, the FHIR implementation guides may get information to and from their payer's front door, but inside the payer's organization or inside the payer's house, there are several systems that may contribute to the determination for a prior authorization. And those systems are beyond the scope of the implementation guide, but are necessary that the payer have things in order so that they can provide a question or questionnaire to get the clinical data that is required to make a determination, and then to get that determination back to the provider. So in the The green boxes, we illustrate the things here that are kind of behind the curtain inside the provider organization or inside the payer organization, and the things that are within the scope in the sequence of events that happen between a provider and a payer for the CRD piece, for the DTR piece, and the prior authorization support or the CDEX pieces. Important to the testing and scalability and maturing things are participation in Connectathon events. This slide just illustrates what we've done in the burden reduction track. And this is a publicly accessible resource on HL7's Confluence space that you can see by several Connectathon events and the tracks that are organized under those events. And I've highlighted here the burden reduction track, which is the scope of the focus for today. With the aims and aspirations of standards and scalability, the essential ingredient goes back to the coalition of the willing. And putting this together, we also are looking at how we build a network of providers and payers. And outside of the scope of the burden reduction track itself, in healthcare, we see the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, TEFCA, network that is being built across the nation. And that's bringing together providers and payers at various levels of participation for treatment use cases, but are also expanding to operations and payment use cases in the future. And that's an encouraging aspect for payers to join up in the TEFCA networks and exchange data for transactional flows like prior authorization, but also for payers to have the clinical data that supports the payer understanding their members, particularly new members at enrollment. Underlying all of this is the essential nature of collaboration. So providers and payers need to work together. It's not a natural inclination for payers and providers to work together beyond what they're required to do. But when it comes to data exchange and FHIR implementations, particularly for burden reduction, payers and providers might think in terms of geographic markets as the first place that they want to align. For example, if I have a provider in California, it makes sense to align with the payers that I work with for the patients that I serve. But in the early days of getting this scaled, not every organization has that geographic alignment. So the other considerations to include are whether you are aligned on technical capabilities. Not everyone is at the same level of proficiency with FHIR. So finding a partner, a provider partner if you're a payer, or payer if you're a provider partner, that has similar FHIR capabilities so that you can work together at the same level, as well as learn from the same level, that's another way to align. Resource availability is also a key thing because sometimes these things get done off the side of the desk because it's difficult to get a project approved for FHIR work that heretofore hasn't been driven by regulatory mandates. Another key element in provider and payer collaboration is that it can't remain just a point-to-point collaboration anymore. For scalability, for it to have the return on the investment that you put into the things that you develop, the time and energy, you need to have partnerships that can grow outward. So for example, if you're a provider, you would like to be able to partner with other payers and expand the work that you've done in that first case. And likewise, from the payer perspective, to work with other providers. In terms of maturing the testing that goes on with FHIR, there's a cycle that mimics the regular maturity of FHIR implementation guides. It initially kicks off with a use case discovery. You find something that you want, a problem that you want to solve together, a business problem in business terms. And then when it relates to interoperability and you want to do it with FHIR, if that's appropriate, then you can kick into the cycle of building a FHIR implementation guide at its initial draft at this point, then going into taking that implementation guide, building your first solution, your first reference implementation from that, and then going into testing with multiple partners where a partner brings their particular instance of building from the implementation guide, which may be biased by their interpretation, how they read the implementation guide, testing that with the reference implementation, whether one's a client, one's a server, one's an app, or one's an API. There are different roles. Going through that testing, which can be done at your own pace, outside of a Connectathon event, or within a Connectathon event, or leading up to or following a Connectathon event. From the Connectathon event or from the self-paced testing, you find various results that can feed back to what's in the implementation guide and say, we interpreted the implementation guide in this way, and the testing showed errors that we need to address. So if we change the implementation guide to adjust for and make things functional from the error findings, that would feed into the next version of the implementation guide. And this cycle can be repeated to the point where the implementation guide becomes more normalized. We see greater adoption because the interpretation becomes more standardized and people are interpreting it in the same way and it's functioning the way that's expected. When it comes to that testing flow, it's essential to form the relationships, find the partners that you want to test with. If you're a payer and you're supporting an API for prior auth, as is our example here, you want to find providers that are willing or able to incorporate into their environments a Smart on FHIR app that calls the API, or as we progress further into the future where there's native functionality in the EMR that would call the payer's API. Next step is a really basic one, but it does take, getting developers on a phone call maybe for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a few iterations of that to establish connectivity, getting the app registered if we're working with a Smart on FHIR app, and also do the technical pings to make sure that as you go through, for example, a week and there's a maintenance window on the weekend, that if the instance is brought down, that it does come back up in time so you can continue testing. So establishing connectivity, while it's an important first step, is one that may have to be repeated from time to time. And then, of course, the heart of this is that you conduct the testing, so you come up with your plan, you come up with your test steps. They're related back to how you founded the partnership in the first place. And then you align them with the FHIR implementation guide and see how it meets the business objectives that you set from the partnership, as well as how it relates to the FHIR implementation guides that you're testing. Coming out of the testing flow itself, you want to review the results, share them with each other, of course, your partners in direct fashion, but also to share them in the community at large so that others that you may not be directly testing with may have the benefits of the results of your testing, as well as those feedback into the implementation guide, referring back to the previous slide. So evolving the testing over time from where we are today, I present that in a few stages, such as prototype testing, which could be the earlier version of Connectathon testing, where it's based on testing that you do in your own organization as well, but also the point-to-point testing you do with individual partners, and then how that plays into Connectathon events and your participation in them. This is kind of where we are today. Where we could move forward, and there's some indications of this being done already today, and this is the way that my company has also started to move, is product testing, and bringing that into the Connectathon as well, where our products conform to the implementation guides. We participate in those tracks in the Connectathons to ensure that our conformance is more than just an attestation, but that there's opportunities to certify or accredit the applications that you're building. This is a new area that's not fully developed yet, but it's on the horizon. Part of that is also the scalability. And then further into the future, we'll see full interoperability community level testing where people and organizations that have implementations based on FHIR implementation guides can actually test their production implementations and make sure that they're conformant, and even more than conformant, that they actually do perform the intended functions. And as we go further into the future, where prior authorization FHIR APIs are the norm, making sure that they still work from time to time and that they don't fall out of conformance, particularly as we go through new versions of implementation guides. So at this point, we're finding that we're at an inflection point with interoperability. In years past, we've worked on the specifications, we've worked on the implementation guides, discovering use cases and building out from them. We've had early adopters working on things and getting them even into production in some cases. But now, particularly with CMS regulation and ONC regulation as a driver, we're seeing that adoption grow and grow into production implementations as well. And into the future, we'll see that manifest as regulatory compliance, as newer and refined implementations, and implementations that are differentiated for competitive advantage in some cases, but also for new use cases and for improved functionality on existing use cases. So at this point, I'd like to entertain any questions. Yeah. Do you want a microphone?
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mario Highland and I'm with Aegis, and I'm doing another session here at 1:45 on testing. When we look at the IGs today, IGs are produced by many different authors, and the implementers struggle with being able to understand the IG and how to implement it. The process of understanding how to test an IG is the entire life cycle of the IG development process. It starts even before the specifications are finished. It's very hard for an IG community to review or ballot an IG because they don't even know how it's going to be implemented, and they're having to mentally grok, like, how is this going to be used? And so they get through the ballot process and they finalize or they get something published, and then they start to think about, well, how am I going to implement it? And that's what we're seeing people, that's when we see people starting to talk about testing. That's wrong. Many of the RIs are level 1 RIs at best, and they do some of what the IG does. So there's a lot, there needs to be a community rise of conversation around how difficult it is to test. And if we don't get the implementation community, if we can't give to the implementation community all the tools that are calibrated and pristine, then I don't understand how we're going to do this. And we got version awareness issues. There's a whole challenge we have here. And the goal is to get to the ROI, but I don't know how we're going to do all this.
And I don't have a magic formula for that either, Mario, and I appreciate the comments you're making here, because this is not a done deal today, right? This is something that we're going to have to put the sweat equity into. We're going to have to make mistakes, identify those mistakes, rectify those mistakes, and keep moving forward. Today, we're still in the early phases. We're on the prior slide, I had the early phase of prototype. We're not out of that today, but we need to keep moving forward in order to get to production. So it's identifying the questions, identifying the problems, and addressing them.
So this information is extremely helpful, and Mario always makes very good points. One thing that at Lantana that we're discovering, I work for Lantana Consulting Group, and I actually am the burden reduction track lead for the Connectathons. But to Mario's point, what we find is that we don't want to wait till we're down the road for the testing phase. It's too late at that point. We want iterative and continual testing up front in conjunction with implementation guide development, as well as the features that are being brought about by the community at large, the stakeholders, the non-technical people. So we're finding that that's a very successful plan. It's not perfect, like Mike said. We're learning a lot as we go in this process, but it's making progress by leaps and bounds. So I think that we're getting there. There's a lot of work. People like Mike himself has been heavily involved in the Connectathons that we've been running, and and our wonderful track page that we work on. And so it's the integration of people like Mario's team, people like Mike, and many others. And if anyone's interested in participating in that process, you're welcome to join. But anyway, I just want to say that there's a lot of work being done there. There's a long way to go, just like Mario said, but we're making huge strides in that direction.
Yeah, and I put this slide back up to indicate the URL at the bottom. If you go to the Confluence page for HL7 to the Connectathons space, this is a great way to find information so you can get involved. It's a great time to get involved because we're all still in the early phases of figuring things out, but we've got great structure for how we do things leading up to Connectathons, coming out of them as well. So I've been told my time is up. If there's no further questions, we'll conclude here, and if there are questions, certainly meet me at the back. Thank you.